She told Preston Vale, in a voice so level it surprised even herself, that he could leave the same way he came in. He stood in the doorway of the Slade kitchen in his good wool coat, with his lawyer's letter folded in one hand, and that expression on his face, the expression of a man who expects the furniture to rearrange itself at his convenience, and he looked at Adeline Farrow the way people look at inconveniences they hadn't properly accounted for. "Mrs. Slade," he said, drawing out the title the way some men do when they want the word itself to feel fraudulent. "You have been here, 6 weeks? You have no legal standing in this matter. No history with this land, no blood claim, nothing. You are, if you'll forgive me being plain, a stranger." "Then you should be more careful," Adeline said, "about what you say in front of strangers. Some of us listen." She had not always been that composed. 6 weeks ago, standing on the platform at Heron Flats with a single trunk and wind sharp enough to cut glass, she had not been composed at all. She had been 28 years old and completely alone in a territory she'd never seen, holding a letter she'd read so many times the ink had worn faint at the folds. The letter had come in February, when the snow was banked up to the window ledges of her father's house in Guelph, and there was no longer any pretending the house was going to be hers to keep. Her father had died in November, quietly in his sleep, which was the kindest thing he'd done for her in years, and what he'd left behind was a modest estate entirely consumed by modest debts. The furniture went first, then the books. Then Adeline began to understand that the house itself would follow, and that she, at 28, with a teacher's certificate and nothing else, would be left standing outside it in the Guelph winter with no particular plan. She had answered 2 advertisements before the one from the Dominion Land Registry Agency, both from widowers in Manitoba, who had written in the cheerless shorthand of men who considered a wife roughly equivalent to a good hired hand. She had not responded to either. The 3rd advertisement was different, not warmer exactly, but honest in a way that made her trust it. Mr. R. Slade of the Slade Horse Ranch, Heron Flats, Assiniboia District, Northwest Territories, requires a capable woman for year-round management of the household. The work is hard and the prairie winters are not for the faint-hearted. I do not make promises I cannot keep, and I ask for the same in return. What I offer, a roof, fair wages, and honest employment. Reply only if you are serious." She had written back the same evening. She was serious. She had always been serious, in the way that women who grew up keeping their father's accounts and their mother's house, out of necessity, learned to be serious about things that mattered. His reply came in 10 days, brief, blunt, with directions to Heron Flats and a date. She arrived on a Thursday in the first week of April, when the Assiniboia prairie was still the pale brown of winter not quite finished, the sky so wide and so flat above it that she felt she could see the curvature of the earth. The wagon that met her at the platform was driven by a man named Emmett, 40ish, sparse, with the kind of quiet that came from years of working with animals and not needing much else from life. He drove without conversation, which Adeline took either as unfriendliness or respect, and couldn't yet tell which. Rowan Slade was standing in the yard when the wagon came up the lane. She had formed no particular picture of him on the train. She'd been deliberate about that, the way you are careful not to build something you'll have to take apart. But seeing him, tall, angular, with the kind of stillness that isn't restfulness but something held carefully in place, she felt the word that came to her was contained. He was a man who had put himself somewhere and was staying there by force of will. He did not come toward her. He watched her climb down from the wagon with an expression that gave nothing away. "Miss Farrow," he said. "Mr. Slade." She extended her hand. He shook it, briefly, with a grip that was strong and impersonal, the grip of a man shaking hands with a business proposition. "Emmett'll show you the house," he said. "Supper's yours from tonight." And he walked back toward the barn. Behind her, Emmett made a quiet sound. Not quite a cough, not quite a laugh. "Don't take it personal," he said, picking up her trunk. "He's the same with everybody." "How long has he been the same with everybody?" she asked. Emmett was quiet for a moment. "Going on 4 years," he said. She didn't ask what had happened 4 years ago. The house told her. The Slade ranch house was larger than she expected. 2 stories, good timber, built by someone who meant it to last, but it had the specific emptiness of a place where the people had gone and the things had stayed. Not neglect exactly. The floors were swept. The windows had been wiped, though not recently. But there was a woman's winter coat on the hook by the back door, dark wool too small for Rowan Slade, a child's drawing, a horse, recognizably a horse if you were charitable, in red crayon, was tacked to the kitchen wall beside the stove, and on the shelf above the bedroom door, barely visible until you were directly beneath it, a pair of small knitted booties the color of cream, folded together, placed there with deliberate care. Adeline set her carpetbag down in the kitchen and stood still for a long moment, taking it in the way you take in a room that is telling you something important. Then she rolled up her sleeves and started a fire in the cook stove. She made a simple supper, salt pork and potatoes and the last of some dried herbs she'd found in a tin, and set the table the way her mother had always insisted, plate centered, cutlery straight. When Rowan came in at 6:30, he stopped for just a moment at the sight of it. Something moved across his face and was gone before she could name it. He sat, he ate, he said nothing until he had finished, and then he said, "There's a list of duties on the desk in the office. Start tomorrow." "I'll have it read tonight," she said. He nodded and left the kitchen. She sat alone for a while, listening to the prairie dark pressed against the window panes. There was no wind that night, which Emmett had told her on the drive was unusual. She wrapped her hands around her cooling tea and let herself feel all of it, the strangeness, the size of the sky, the weight of the coat on the hook, before she took a steady breath and put it all in its proper place. She had known it would not be easy. She had not been wrong. The first 2 weeks were an education in silence and in what could be communicated without words. Rowan Slade moved through his own ranch like a man who had made a private agreement with the world. He would do his work, and the world would leave him alone. He was in the barn before she had the stove lit, and he came in only for meals, eating without speaking, leaving without ceremony. The list of duties was 8 items long. She completed all 8 and added 4 more that the house plainly required. She found the ranch ledgers in the office off the kitchen, and what she found in them was the kind of disorder that grief makes. Not laziness, not carelessness, but the specific disorder of a man who has stopped being interested in the future because the future no longer feels like a place worth going. She had seen it before, in her father after her mother died. She knew the fingerprints of it. She said nothing about the ledgers. She organized them, she cross-referenced them against the bills of sale stacked in the desk drawer, and found 2 discrepancies with a feed supplier in Regina, minor but real. She corrected the quarterly tallies and noted the hay supply would run short by October if the south pasture wasn't replanted. She left the corrected ledgers on the desk and said nothing. It was Rowan who brought it up. He came into the office on a Sunday afternoon, which he never did, and stood in the doorway looking at the ledgers. "You went through the accounts," he said. "The accounts were on the list," she said, without turning from the window. Silence. "The south pasture," he said finally. "Needs replanting before June," she said. "You have time, but not much." Another silence. Longer. She turned. He was looking at the ledger she'd corrected, not at her. His jaw was tight in the way it went tight when something was landing that he hadn't wanted to receive. "The feed supplier," he said, "has been rounding up on your orders for at least 2 seasons," she said. "I can draft a letter if you like." He looked at her then. Really looked, the way he hadn't since the day she arrived, with something other than flat assessment. "Where did you learn ledger work like that?" he said. "My father had a business," she said. "Before he lost it, I kept his books from the time I was 15. "What happened to it?" "He decided whiskey was a better partner than arithmetic," she said. "The business was gone by the time I was 20. Something shifted in his face, not warmth but a slight softening of the careful distance. He pulled up the chair, sat across the desk from her and said, "Show me." That was the first afternoon they spent in the same room on purpose. He was sharper than he looked. He asked precise questions and listened to the answers without comment, and when she showed him the feed supplier discrepancy, he sat back and pressed 2 fingers against his mouth in the particular way of a man calibrating something he'd missed. "I should have caught that," he said. "You had other things on your mind," she said carefully. He looked at her. "Don't do that," he said quietly. "Don't make allowances." "I'm not making allowances," she said. "I'm stating a fact. You were managing this ranch alone, and you had other things on your mind. That's not an excuse. It's context." He said nothing to that. But when he stood to leave, he paused at the door and said, "The south pasture seed is in the barn loft. Emmett knows where, and there was something in it. Not gratitude exactly, but the recognition of a man who had decided, slightly against his will, that something was useful. It was Emmett who told her about Catherine. It came out one April afternoon when she was mending fence on the east side, and Emmett fell into step beside her, and after a while he said without preamble, "Catherine was his wife, in case you were wondering about the coat." Adeline kept her hands on the wire. "I'd figured," she said. "She died in the winter, 4 years back. The baby too, they both went the same night." He paused. "It was a bad one. The blizzard came in fast and the road to town was closed. He couldn't get her out." She absorbed that without speaking. "He's not a bad man," Emmett said, which people say when they feel they have to say it, because they aren't sure the listener can see it yet. He stopped. "I know what stopping looks like," she said. Emmett looked at her. "I expect you do," he said. She understood the drawing on the kitchen wall better after that. Not Catherine's, the child's, red crayon, the horse that might have been a horse. There had been a child before then, or Catherine had been pregnant when she died. She didn't press for more. Some things a house tells you, and you receive them quietly. She never moved the coat. She never touched the booties on the shelf. She understood without being told that these were not hers to move. Preston Vale arrived on a Wednesday 6 weeks after Adeline had come. She knew him before she knew his name, because he had the particular bearing of a man who expects his arrival to change the room, and he looked around the Slade kitchen with the proprietary assessment of someone calculating what should belong to him. "Adeline Farrow," he said, which was interesting, because she hadn't introduced herself. "Adeline Slade," she said. They had been properly married in Heron Flats the 2nd week of April, with the land registry magistrate and Emmett, and a woman named Nettie Holbrook from the general store as witnesses. And she said the name looking directly at Preston Vale, watching him process it the way a man processes an obstacle he hadn't fully mapped. He was Catherine's brother. She understood that within the first 3 minutes. He had that quality Catherine must have had, something in the set of the jaw, the particular way of carrying the head, and he used it the way some people use a resemblance to the dead, as leverage. Rowan came in at 3:30. What passed between the two men in the brief moment before Preston stood up told her everything about the history there. A complicated grief and a complicated guilt. The kind that accumulates between people who have loved the same person and lost them, and cannot agree on where the fault lies. Preston stayed an hour. He left without saying what he'd come to say, but what he'd come to say was visible in the way he looked at the house before he got on his horse, the particular look of a man measuring a thing he intends to take. That evening after supper, Adeline said, "He's going to file a claim on the ranch, isn't he?" Rowan looked at her across the table. He was quiet for a moment. "He says Catherine's father left the land to Catherine, not to me, that the deed should have passed to her family when she died." "Do you have the original deed?" she asked. "In the strong box." "And the will?" He was quiet again, differently this time. "I don't know what will," he said. "Catherine's father died 2 years before she did. I never saw a will." "Preston has one," she said, "or says he does." She could see the thing in Rowan's face that she had begun to learn to read. Not anger at the surface, but something slower and more exhausted underneath it. The anger of a man who has been holding the weight of something for a long time and has run low on the energy to keep holding. "You can't let him take it," she said. "I know." "Then show me the deed," she said, "tonight." He got the strong box. What the deed showed was straightforward. The land had been filed in Rowan Slade's name when they first broke ground 11 years ago. There was no mention of a secondary claim, no codicil, no condition tied to Catherine's family. Whatever Preston Vale claimed to have in the way of a will, it would have to contend with an 11-year-old land title filed with the Dominion Land Registry. "This is solid," Adeline said. "Preston has money for lawyers," Rowan said flatly. "I don't." "You have the original registry filing," she said. "That's federal, not territorial. It doesn't run through the local courts." She paused, looking at the document spread between them in the lamplight. "I need to go to town tomorrow. I want to look at the public land records at the registry office." "Why?" "Because if Preston has done this before, and men like Preston usually have done this before, it'll be in the public record, and if there's a pattern, a federal land commissioner will want to know about it." The lamp flickered. Outside, the Assiniboia night was vast and still. "How do you know about federal land commissioners?" he said. "I read," she said, "and my father's solicitor in Guelph had a partner who handled Dominion land cases. I sat in on 3 of them when I was 17 because there was nowhere else to sit and nothing else to do." She looked at him steadily. "This is fixable, Rowan, but you have to let me try." He held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved in his face, the slow, difficult movement of a man who has been alone with something for so long that the idea of help feels almost foreign, something to be treated with suspicion before it can be received. "All right," he said. She went to town the next morning alone. Emmett drove her to Heron Flats and waited with the wagon, while she walked into the land registry office and requested the public records of property claims in the district for the past 15 years. The clerk, a young man with ink on his cuffs, helped her without objection. She was 2 hours in the records when she found it. Not Preston Vale's name directly, his father's name, Edgar Vale, and then, in a filing from 7 years prior, a property dispute involving a homestead to the north of Heron Flats, a dispute in which Edgar Vale had produced a handwritten will of dubious provenance, and the territorial court had found in his favor by a margin that Adeline, reading the summary, found thin enough to see through. The Hollis family, she wrote the name down. There was one more. A water claim from 4 years back contested by a widow named Florence Greer, resolved in Vale family favor. She wrote that down too. She was copying the second filing when the door opened and Preston Vale walked in. He looked at her across the office with the flat assessment of a man recalibrating. "Mrs. Slade," he said. "Mr. Vale." She kept her voice pleasant and her hand still on the paper. "This is a public office," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "These are public records." He walked toward her, slowly, using space the way some men do, deliberately, to make a point. "You're going to cause a great deal of disruption for no good reason," he said. "What Rowan has built here, what my sister helped him build, it belongs to her family now that she's gone. That is simple justice." "Simple justice would be the original deed," she said, "which is in Rowan's name. A will supersedes a deed if the grantor's intent." "If the will is legitimate," she said. She met his eyes directly. "Is it legitimate, Mr. Vale?" The silence between them was its own kind of answer. "Go home, Mrs. Slade," he said quietly. "This is not your business." "My husband's land is my business," she said. She gathered her papers. "And I think you'll find that what your father did to the Hollis family, and what he did to Florence Greer, is going to become someone else's business before long." She walked out without hurrying. She made herself walk at her regular pace all the way to the wagon, and she climbed up, and she took the reins, and only when she had turned the horse onto the main road did she exhale, long and slow, and notice that her hands were trembling. They steadied before she reached the ranch. She told Rowan everything that evening, the records, the Hollis name, Florence Greer, the confrontation. She told it plainly, without dramatizing, watching his face as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet. Then, "He put his hand on you." "He didn't touch me," she said. "He stood close. There's a difference." She looked at him. "What matters is the Hollis family. If their claim was manipulated the same way he's trying to manipulate yours, we have a pattern, and a pattern is a federal case, not a territorial one." He was looking at her with something she hadn't seen on him before. Not the careful distance, not the flat assessment, but something raw and present and off balance, the expression of a man who has been surprised by something that came in from a direction he wasn't watching. "Why are you doing this?" he said, not a challenge, genuinely baffled. "This isn't the arrangement you agreed to. You could walk away from this entirely." She looked at him. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go," she said. "That's the truth, and I won't dress it up. But I stayed because this ranch is worth fighting for, and so are you, and I don't know how to watch worth keeping fall apart without trying to stop it." She paused. "That's all." He looked at her for a long time. The kitchen held the sound of the fire and the sound of the prairie wind starting up outside, and something else that was harder to name, the sound of a wall that was still standing but had developed, somewhere in its foundations, a hairline crack. "There's a solicitor in Regina," he said quietly, "a man named Bertrand Houle. He handled Dominion land cases before he came west. I haven't spoken to him in years." "Write to him tonight," she said. He did. The letter from Bertrand Houle came 12 days later. Emmett brought it from the post office at a near run and handed it to Adeline, who set it on the kitchen table and did not open it, because it was addressed to Rowan. She waited 20 minutes for him to come in from the north field. He read it standing at the table, and she watched his face as he read. When he finished, he slid it across to her. Hoole would take the case. But he needed the original Vale will, the document Preston claimed to possess, produced under examination. Without it, the pattern argument rested on circumstantial evidence, strong but not sufficient. She read the second page, where Hoole had outlined a path through the federal process, a complaint to the Dominion Land Commission, which could compel production of the will and order a halt on any property transfer pending investigation. If he's done this twice before, she said, and the documents exist, the examiner will find the pattern in the paper itself, the ink, the provenance, who witnessed it. Preston won't produce the will voluntarily, Rowan said. No, she agreed, but a federal commissioner will make him. She looked up. Hoole needs to file the complaint, and he needs every piece of the public record documentation I copied. Rowan was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through the implications, the exposure, the risk, the fact that once they moved publicly, Preston would move too, and faster. The Hollis family, he said. Would they speak to it? I know where to start looking, she said. He looked at her. You already started looking, he said. Not accusatory, something else. Something that was beginning to sound like recognition. I thought we might need them, she said simply. The corner of his mouth moved, barely. Not a smile exactly, but the suggestion of one, the ghost of what a smile had been before it was something he'd stopped using. Write to Hoole tonight, he said. Tell him we're filing. I already have the draft, she said. That sound again, the not-quite smile, and this time it was accompanied by something in his eyes that she hadn't seen there before, not warmth exactly, but the absence of the thing that had been keeping warmth out. Of course you do, he said. The night before Rowan left for Regina, she found him standing in the kitchen long after supper was cleared, his hand resting on the wall beside the child's red crayon drawing. She came and stood a few feet behind him and waited. Catherine drew that, he said without turning. She wasn't much of an artist, and she knew it, and she laughed about it. She put it up herself. A pause. Said it was the only horse she'd ever tamed. It looks like a horse, Adeline said, which was kinder than accurate. He made a sound, low, private, not quite a laugh but related to one, then he turned. The lamp on the table threw his face half into shadow, and in the shadow she could see the thing he kept under the careful stillness, the grief that had been living in him for 4 years like a tenant who had paid no rent and made itself at home. She wanted to go to the city, he said, when the baby was coming. She wanted to go to Regina, to a proper hospital. I told her the weather would hold, that it was too early. He stopped. His jaw worked once. It wasn't too early, and the weather didn't hold. The kitchen was very quiet. It wasn't your fault, Adeline said. I made the choice, he said. Yes, she said. She did not take it away from him, because she had learned that taking grief away from people was not the same as helping them carry it. And you've been carrying that for 4 years, and you're allowed to put it down, Rowan. Not because you were right, but because carrying it like this, alone, in a house that stopped, isn't doing anything for her, and it's costing you everything. He looked at her, directly, fully, the way he hadn't done since those first days. How do you know how to say the true thing? He said, quietly. My mother taught me, she said. She said the most unkind thing you can do for someone in grief is make it smaller than it is. She said grief deserves its full size. You just have to learn to live at that size, rather than inside of it. Something moved in his face, the hairline crack widening, not collapsing, just giving way the way good structures do when they finally decide to make room. Tell me about Catherine, Adeline said. Not how she died, what she was like. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down at the kitchen table, and she sat across from him, and he talked for an hour. He described the way Catherine had argued with him about the south pasture drainage for 2 full seasons before she was proven right, and the way she used to sing to the horses at dawn because she claimed they were better for it. And she had made him admit, eventually, that the horses probably were. He described her laugh, big, unguarded, the kind that startled strangers, and the way she had named every horse on the property, regardless of whether they were for sale, so that buyers would arrive and she would have to very carefully not use the names in front of them. When he finished, the lamp was burning low. "She sounds like someone the world needed more of," Adeline said. He nodded once slowly. "Yes," he said, "she was." He left for Regina the next morning before light. She stood on the porch and watched the horse carry him down the lane and out to the road, and then she went inside and made coffee and began the work of waiting without being idle. The telegram came 3 days later. Emmett ran it from town. Adeline took it from him at the gate and read it before she reached the house. The Dominion Land Commission had reviewed the complaint. A federal examiner had been authorized to compel production of the Vale will for document analysis. All property transfers in the district involving Vale family interests were suspended pending review. She sat on the porch steps with the telegram in her hands, and the Assiniboia sky above her was the color of good wool, gray and enormous and indifferent to human trouble in the way that only prairie sky can be, and she breathed out slowly and let herself feel the full weight of what it meant. She was still sitting there when Nettie Holbrook arrived with a pot of soup and the news that the youngest son of the Hollis family, now 30, who had watched his father lose their homestead to the Vale family when he was 12, had given a sworn statement to Hoole's clerk that morning. He had been waiting 12 years for someone to ask. Nettie sat down on the porch beside her. She was a solid, plain-spoken woman who had run the Heron Flats general store for 20 years and knew everything that mattered about every person in the district. "You know," Nettie said, "I've watched that ranch from a distance since Catherine died. Watched Rowan close it down from the inside, like a house shutting itself against winter." She paused. "And then you arrived, and within a month the south pasture was replanted, and the ledgers were balanced, and Preston Vale finally has something to answer for." She looked at Adeline directly. "I don't know what you were expecting when you got off that wagon, but I'll tell you what we were hoping for." "What was that?" Adeline asked. "Someone who'd stay," Nettie said simply. Rowan came home on a Friday evening. She heard the horse in the yard, and she did not go to the door immediately, because her legs were not entirely steady, and she did not want him to see her watching for him. She heard his boots on the porch, the door, the sound of him in the mudroom. Then he came into the kitchen. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and she watched him see it on her face before she said a word. "The telegram," he said. "Commission ordered the examination," she said. "The examiner is coming Tuesday, and the Hollis Sun gave a statement." He stood very still. "It's not over," she said, "but the ground has shifted. Preston can't move on the property now." Rowan crossed the kitchen. He sat down at the table, across from her, close, the way they sat when they were working through documents together, and he put both hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at her. "The will was altered," he said quietly. "Hoole's examiner confirmed it in preliminary analysis. The signature is Catherine's father's, but 2 of the property clauses were added in a different ink. Added after the original was witnessed and signed." The kitchen absorbed that. "He did the same thing to the Hollis family," she said. "Yes." "And to Florence Greer." "Yes." He looked at her. "You knew." "I suspected," she said. "The pattern was the same. Men like that, they don't get creative. They use what works." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire snapped. Outside, the prairie evening was coming in soft and gray and immense. "Adeline," he said. "Rowan," she said. "I want to say something I don't know how to say well," he said, "so I'll just say it plainly." He held her gaze with the steady, undecorated honesty that she had come to understand was his truest register. "I wrote that advertisement because my lawyer told me I needed a wife, and Emmett told me the house was killing me. I didn't write it expecting anything more than a practical arrangement. I didn't believe anything more was possible." He paused. "I was wrong." The kitchen held that between them. "I know," she said quietly, "so did I." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, not briefly, with intention. She looked down at his hand and then up at his face, and what was there now? Open, present, slightly off balance in the way of a man who has stepped back into something he'd believed was gone from him, was the truest thing she'd seen since she arrived. "This isn't what you signed on for," he said. "No," she agreed. "It turned out to be considerably more interesting." That sound again, the laugh that had been buried for 4 years, rougher now, than it probably once been, unpracticed but real. It was the best thing she had heard since she stepped off the train. The federal examination took 6 weeks. The Vail will was ruled fraudulent. The document examiner confirmed that 3 clauses, including the one that would have transferred the Slade Ranch to Catherine's family, had been added in different ink, in a different hand, after the original was signed and witnessed. Edgar Vail had altered it himself, not for the first time, and Preston had inherited both the document and the habit. The Hollis homestead claim was reopened for review. Florence Greer's water rights were restored. Preston Vail paid a substantial monetary penalty and left Heron Flats before the summer was out. No one in the district mentioned him much after that. There was more interesting business to attend to. The Slade Ranch recovered the way a garden recovers when someone begins to pay it attention. Slowly, then with increasing momentum, until the progress became its own kind of evidence. The south pasture came in thicker than it had in years. The horses, Rowan's particular gift, the thing he had always been best at, breeding and training and the slow patient building of trust between a man and an animal, were brought back into order, and with them a reputation that had gone quiet for 4 years and began carefully to speak again. Emmett was promoted to foreman and received the news with an expression of studied indifference that lasted approximately 3 minutes before he went out to the barn, and spent the rest of the afternoon talking to the horses with the air of a man processing significant feelings. Nettie Holbrook came by the ranch so regularly that she eventually stopped pretending she needed a reason, and Adeline stopped pretending she wasn't glad of it. One October afternoon, with the prairie turned gold and the first cold coming down from the north like a promise being kept, Adeline was at the desk in the office, her desk now, unmistakably, the way the whole house had become unmistakably hers, without either of them marking the moment it happened. When Rowan came in from outside and stood in the doorway watching her work. "You're writing to your cousin in Guelph," he said. "Frances," she said. "She keeps asking when she can visit." "Tell her spring," he said. "The road's reliable after the thaw." She looked up. He was leaning in the doorframe with his arms crossed, and on his face was the expression she had learned over these months to receive as his version of everything that other men said at length, and with more words, steady, complete, and entirely without apology. "Rowan," she said. "Adeline," he said. "Are you happy?" she asked. He considered the question the way he considered everything that mattered. Seriously, without performance, giving it the weight it deserved. "Yes," he said, simply, completely. The way a man answers when the answer has stopped feeling complicated. She turned back to her letter, smiling, and did not hide it, because there was no longer any reason to be careful. Outside, the October prairie stretched in every direction under a sky so wide and so indifferent and so magnificent that it made the smallness of any single life feel not diminished but exactly right, held, as everything on the prairie is held, by something so much larger than itself that the only reasonable response is to stay, and to be present, and to choose every morning to be exactly where you are.